You may remember, some of us, you remember back in 1985, Coca-Cola intentionally changed to an inferior, what people thought was an inferior formula called the New Coke. And the conspiracy theories began right away. Why did they take such a good, solid product and replace it with the New Coke? Well, we've got it figured out. It was to stir up demand for the original Coke. That's why they did it, was the theory of the conspirators. Did you know that the planet Earth, say the flat earthers, is not a sphere, and that evidence has been faked or suppressed to hide the fact that this Earth is actually a disk? That's the conspiracy theory. And, well, what about GPS devices? Well, GPS devices, they're all rigged. They are rigged to make aircraft pilots wrongly believe that they're flying around a globe. That's the theory. Conspiracy theories. They're all around us. Maybe these days it seems more and more we hear about them. Conspiracy theories reject the accepted narrative that goes with certain events. The moon landing in 1969, that's all a Hollywood soundstage stunt. Never happened, just something put on by NASA. It denies the realities. It denies the official version. And in fact, the official version of events may be seen as part of the conspiracy. Oh, they're just making that up to have us believe that. Conspiracy theories seem to come to play, and maybe this explains why in the last few years there's been such a resurgence of them. The conspiracy theories really seem to come to the forefront when we're feeling anxious. And certainly with everything happening in the world in the past few years, there's been a lot of anxiety. So maybe that's why there's been all sorts of conspiracy theories to explain what has been happening. Or when we're facing hardship, or when there's uncertainty and we just don't know what's happening or why things are happening. And we as human beings, we have to have some explanation. We have to figure out why. And so we come up with summary. And if we can't really understand why something's happening, there's something sinister. We can explain it. And maybe it's all due to our desire as human beings to make sense of the social forces around us that are so threatening. And so, conspiracy theories. I want to take you this morning to a first century conspiracy theory. It's found in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew slips in a small episode in the middle of his account of the resurrection of Jesus. And this small episode that Matthew slips in allows us to witness the birth of one of the oldest conspiracy theories. So, as we've already heard this morning, the women go to the tomb at the crack of dawn on the first day of the week, and they're greeted by this messenger of God, this angel of the Lord, who announces to them that Jesus is risen from the dead. And so they have joy in their hearts, and they hurry off to share this extraordinary news with the disciples. But then Matthew, and we're in Matthew 28, if you want to follow along in your Bibles, Matthew goes on to highlight another response to the news of Christ's resurrection. And I invite you to reread Matthew 28, verses 11 through 15. So while the women are on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. Stone rolled away, the tomb is empty. And the chief priests had met with the elders, and they devised a plan. And they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say this. This is what you're to say. If anybody asks you, why is the tomb empty?" His disciples came during the night, and they stole him away while we were asleep. Why do we need to say? Because if this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him, keep you out of trouble. because as guards, you were supposed to be keeping watch. So the soldiers took the money, did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. So while the women are on their way to share the extraordinary news of the resurrection of Jesus to the disciples, Matthew notes that some of the tomb guards report the events of the weekend to the chief priests, the religious authorities of the day. And the religious authorities consult with the elders, and together they come up with this conspiracy to conceal what really happened, because it's upsetting. It throws their world upside down. It cannot be explained. It challenges everything that they thought they knew. And so we have to come up with an explanation. They don't undertake any attempt to try to figure out what really happened. They don't investigate what happened to Jesus' body, because they know that what they might discover will not please them. And for some of us, that's why conspiracy theories are so attractive, because the truth is harder to believe. The truth is harder to accept. And so for these religious authorities, the truth was so hard to accept that they came up with this little conspiracy. And so they would invent what today we would call a conspiracy theory, complete with alternative facts to support it. The disciples came during the night and they stole Jesus' body. And it's plausible. It doesn't matter that these disciples who had taken off, who had fled in fear after the arrest of Jesus, and were nowhere to be found at the foot of the cross. It doesn't matter that these trembling disciples would have had to come at night and face these armed guards. Doesn't matter. Don't worry about that. It doesn't matter that the disciples would have needed to somehow work loose the seals that were placed on the tomb, and that somehow the disciples would have to roll away this massive stone, and then after that, they would have to remove the body of Jesus, and they would do all of that without disrupting anyone who could raise an alarm. And it doesn't square with the disciples who would later be seen risking their lives to proclaim that Jesus had risen. And if they had known, if these disciples knew that this was all a lie, how did they find the courage to face the authorities who are threatening them? Why did they go to jail? Why did they endure persecution, even death, for a lie that could so easily be disproven if it's true? Why preach a gospel if they knew it could be proven to be false? The audacity of the disciples, their courage, their zeal, their persistence, and the whole expansion of Christianity is inexplicable, unexplainable, without the resurrection. But the chief priests, the elders, they don't know all of that yet. And so they make a deal with the soldiers. And the leaders are going to deny the truth, and they're going to drag others into this denial. And they prefer to stay in their way of thinking. They don't want their world upset, their worldview challenged. And so they don't want to know the way. They don't want to know the truth and the life. And so this version of the story, Matthew tells us, has spread among the Jews to this present day. the first century of our current era. People had heard all of this. But it's also our reality today. Even today, there are theories all around us to avoid the truth of the resurrection of Jesus. And people continue to propagate various theories about what really happened with the resurrection. But it isn't because of their believability that those explanations persist. Because frankly, a lot of the explanations that are offered can be easily dismissed, can be easily countered. In fact, the explanation of the guards here is so unbelievable that Matthew feels that he can mention this in this gospel because he knows full well that anyone who wanted could go and check this account. And so Matthew's not afraid to mention this little these shenanigans, if I can use the term, that have gone on. When you want to drown out a truth, when you want to suppress the truth, your lies, your half-truths don't have to be believable. They don't have to be well-founded. It's just enough that your version is what your listeners want to hear, or that your version of events avoids confronting your listeners with a reality that disturbs them. And so I don't want to hear about resurrection because that's not what I want to hear. That changes my whole world. Tell me something different. Well, did you know what really happened? Oh, yeah, that makes sense. I can believe that. Then I can continue on in my way, undisturbed, unperturbed. You might be surprised at the response of these religious leaders in Jesus' day. The one who had been announced as the Messiah, the promised one, had come back to life, had risen, a staggering truth. But instead of euphoria, they react with anger. This was a time when they should have been running in search of the risen one. This was the time when they could have repented of having rejected him. This was the moment when they could open their hearts to the truth and to go and find the disciples and to celebrate with them the redemption of Israel. This was the time that they could assume their role as the religious leaders of the people by acknowledging the truth and calling on people to do likewise. This was the time for them to step forward. But they want to close the file. They want to drown the truth in a lie. They're hardening their hearts. They are facing an unsettling conclusion regarding Jesus' body. But they're refusing to entertain anything that might challenge their worldview, might challenge how they understand things are to be. So they resist and they conspire. What this attitude reveals about human hearts maybe isn't really surprising. The German theologian Wolfhard Pannenberg wrote, "The evidence for Jesus' resurrection is so strong that nobody would question it except for two things. First, it is a very unusual event. And second, if you believe it happened, you have to change the way you live. The resurrection reveals that God intervened in history through Jesus Christ. The resurrection confirms the truth of everything that Jesus taught in his ministry. It confirms the necessity of Jesus dying on the cross to reconcile us with God. The resurrection reveals the greatness of God, the immense love of God, his compassion, and the futility that we have as human beings trying to figure everything out on our own. And all of that is deeply disturbing. And so you can imagine the discomfort of the leaders who rejected the one who has now turned out to be the Messiah. And accepting this new reality is going to forever upset their position, their influence, if it's true. Accepting this as true is going to mark the end of the life that they have built for themselves. So they try to have it another way. That's us as human beings. We often prefer the darkness. We don't want to be disturbed by the light that could set us free. As John puts it, light has come into this world, but people love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light, will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. But wait a minute. Before we judge the religious leaders, let's look at ourselves, right? What'd your mother say? Every time you point to somebody, there's 4 fingers, 3 fingers pointing back at you. How much are the things that we do, the things that we say, how much are they motivated by fear of losing a relationship? You know, if I say this, maybe I won't have a friend anymore. If I do this, maybe they won't love me anymore. How many things do we do and say that are motivated by fears of losing relationship? If it's not a relationship, maybe it's status. Maybe it's our status. What will they think of me? Maybe it's our livelihoods. Maybe it's our communities. Maybe we're motivated by preserving our dignity or keeping control. So how much of what we say and do have all those different motivations behind them? And when my relationships, when my status, when my livelihood, when my dignity, when my control is threatened, then I am stirred to find a different story, a more comforting story, a storyline that allows me to maintain my relationships, maintain my dignity, my status quo, keep control. And so we turn to stories, or we come up with stories that affirm what we believe or what we want to believe, rather than searching for the facts. We are afraid if we search for the facts that maybe we'll have to admit that we're wrong. We were wrong. or that we wronged others, that we said or did something to somebody else that was wrong. Or maybe we're fearful that the facts will reveal that our comfortable world isn't as comfortable as we would like it to be. Maybe our comfortable world is being lost. Maybe we are losing control. And no one wants to see their world collapse. None of us wants to see the fragility or the deceptive nature of what we've clung to, of what we've held to be important, and suddenly realize, oh, it's really not what I thought. And so sometimes we try at all costs to hold together the pieces of a puzzle that are falling apart. Matthew's account offers a reason why Christians might be inclined to embrace conspiracy theories. Since the morning of Jesus' resurrection, more than 2,000 years ago, since that morning, there have been particular forces at work in this world that have as their chief goal and as their main work to obscure the most basic truth of the gospel. And so as Christians, we know very well that truth is something that not everybody will accept. Truth is not something that everyone is going to follow. And we're not surprised that there is a disconnect between what we accept as the truth as Christians, what we hold here this morning as truth, and what the world at large accepts as truth. And there are days, aren't there, when you realize it hits you right in the face, boy, what I hold as truth is so very different from what the world at large holds as truth. As Christians, we frequently find ourselves embracing explanations that differ from the prevailing culture on all sorts of matters. And that makes it a small step for us with the pressure to embrace alternative explanations rather than the truth. Because they appeal to what maybe we want to believe, maybe what we wish to believe. This isn't the reason. This has got to be the reason. For several decades now, we have been living in a period of decline of Christendom in the West, the influence of the Christian faith. And this is a time where we are living here and now. Ours is a time in which the Christian faith has been increasingly pushed to the margins. That's the reality. You can complain about it, you can moan about it, but that's the reality. Christendom, and I'm not sure this is all negative, but Christendom has declined and Christian values are at the margin of our culture. And so as Christians, we find ourselves at odds with the prevailing discussion on all sorts of matters, all sorts of things that are talked about around the water cooler. You stand or sit and listen and you say, boy, I don't know where they're coming from. And so Christians are at odds with the prevailing discussion on, well, let me list just a few prevailing discussions on gender, prevailing discussions on creation, on pluralism and public education or the media. And often we feel that we're being led astray by the prevailing discussions. And we say, that's not, well, maybe we don't feel we can say, that's not right. And in these circumstances, when you're feeling that way, it may be tempting to be less careful about presumed facts. And you may be drawn in to suggestions that are made that, you know what, it's the elites of our day that are controlling all of this. It's the corrupt ones that are causing all of this. And we can also be tempted to praise the greatness of those who present themselves as the protector of Christian values. And we can gravitate to them because we feel so disconnected from our culture, and we can gravitate to those who proclaim themselves as the protectors of Christian values and listen to their various theories of why things are the way they are. And it can be flattering, it can be comforting to believe, you know what, I know something that nobody else, that very few other people, I know really why this is happening. The rest of you, let me tell you, psst. And that's flattering. I know something that most people don't know. But here's God's word, reminding us grace and truth are found in Jesus Christ, not in voices around us. And the Son of God has come and has given us understanding. And we also need to remember this warning of Paul. Knowledge puffs up. See, our knowledge doesn't come from any moral or intellectual superiority that we have over our fellow human beings. Our knowledge doesn't entitle us to believe that we know better in all things. And we mustn't assume that our knowledge of the Bible makes us automatically immune to being deceived, in being led down the garden trail, as the saying goes. Because you just go back to what we've been talking about. The religious leaders in Jesus' day, they knew their scriptures. But that didn't guarantee that they accepted the truth. And so you may know, we may pride ourselves on knowing the Bible inside out. That doesn't mean you cannot be deceived. We're told that few people will accept God's truth. That's a reality. And that, in some ways, may be a good reality check in our faith journey when we face opposition, when people kind of challenge us. We know that this truth is not something, the truth of the gospel, the truth of Christ, the truth of the resurrection is not something that everyone will accept. But we don't take that to embrace all sorts of other things. What I mean is that God's truth is not always the same as what I believe is truth, right? Oh, it'd be so much easier if everything that I believe is true just lines up perfectly with God's truth. But there are all sorts of things, I am sure, there are all sorts of things that I think are true that God one day is going to say to me, Daryl, you're wrong on that. And you know what? It's usually beliefs that I have, things convictions that I have that really have nothing to do with the claims of Christ. That really things that are unimportant to the kingdom of God. And God probably doesn't really care about them. So it's not such a big deal, maybe, if I'm wrong on them. In Matthew's account of the resurrection, there are those who are powerful, the religious leaders, and those who are powerless, like the guards, who just cannot grasp, or maybe they refuse to believe or accept that this traveling teacher from way up north in Nazareth has risen from the dead. And resurrection threatened their status. It threatened their point of view. And so the empty tomb stands as a challenge to them. What we look at this morning as a time of celebration, they look at as challenge. And so they make up some alternate facts, and they invent a conspiracy theory to manage an inconvenient, unsettling truth. They knew what really happened. And the resurrection reports, we know what really happened. The resurrection reports, my friends, they're fake news. Fake news. Ignore them. But Matthew, as we have seen this morning, knew about this conspiracy theory among the leaders of the people. Maybe some of the guards tipped him off to it. I don't know. And a few years after this incident, this episode in Matthew's gospel, there was a very religious Jew who was a fierce persecutor of the Christian movement, who had his life transformed by an encounter with the resurrected Jesus. And Paul doesn't invent alternate facts. He doesn't say that's all fake news. Paul willingly gives up his religious status, a Pharisee of Pharisees, as he says. He willingly gives up his privilege, his understanding of how the world operates, because he is not willing to dismiss the resurrection as a conspiracy. He is not willing to say that's just fake news. He investigates. He's confronted by it. And he faces all sorts of harassment and persecution because of it. But until the very end, he witnesses to the power of the resurrection. Are there any truths that you resist? You just don't want to go there. If that's true, that just turns my whole world upside down. Can't be that way. It's got to be this way. Questions that you refuse to examine. If it's about the resurrection of Jesus, at the center of what we're celebrating today, I invite you to set out to explore, to investigate this central reality of the Christian faith and for the life of every human. What if God actually did raise Jesus from the dead? Don't be afraid of the answers that you might find, even if they call you to change your life. Because life in the light of God's love, life in the light of the resurrection of Christ is infinitely better than anything that you might have to give up, anything that you might lose. What if God actually did it? If you're sitting here this morning and you've already placed your faith in the resurrection of Jesus and you have no question that God actually did it, well, are there places where your faith could be deepened? Are there truths today that you resist? You know, the passages in the Bible that you have highlighted, those verses that you haven't highlighted, those verses that aren't in the red letters. Are there truths today which you resist because they will upset your apple cart? Because you fear what they will mean to your life if you accept that truth? Yeah, I accept the resurrection. God really did it. Well, you know, that part, I'm just not sure I'm ready to go there yet. How can the light of the resurrection help you in your life of faith, in your everyday life? How might the empty tomb push you to not just consider what reinforces your points of view, but what might also challenge your thinking, your point of view? I think as Christians, we should be proud to say, yeah, I've changed my mind on lots of things. I used to think this, and then I was reading the Bible, and I realized, Daryl, you're totally off base on that. Or, you know, I never noticed that verse before. You see, the resurrection places each of our lives, individually and as a community. It places our lives at a crossroads. Will we follow the priests? Will we follow the leaders of the people in the dark, in fear? Or will we turn with the disciples to light and life? The God who raised Jesus from the dead will not abandon those who place their trust in him and walk in his footsteps. And this morning, each one of us can receive life. We can choose life. We can deepen life in Jesus Christ. We can leave the darkness, whatever the price. We can leave it because he's risen. He's risen indeed.